two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Justine Modica. She's a researcher of labor history at ILR at Cornell. We will be talking about the main subject of her research, childcare workers, particularly recently in the United States. Justine Modica, tell us about your project.
I am writing a book that's about the history of childcare workers and childcare as a labor issue in the late 20th century and into the 21st century United States. When I started this project, I was really interested in looking at how childcare workers have organized for better wages and working conditions. Because childcare workers are some of the worst paid workers in the United States, like in the bottom 2% of all occupations nationwide in terms of compensation. And I should maybe just back up a little bit and say when I am talking about childcare workers, I use that term capaciously to think about daycare workers, family child care providers who provide care for children in their own homes, in the providers' homes, and then nannies, au pairs, and domestic workers who provide care in the child's home. So I think about the category, as the kind of Big Ten, all the folks who are caring for young children. But they're all paid horribly. There are obviously some very highly paid nannies, but they're a very tiny, tiny slice of the childcare workforce. And so what I really wanted to understand was, how have these workers grappled with the difficulties of surviving and how they tried to improve their wages and working conditions in the context of the caring workforce and all the various challenges of the care economy. As I was looking into this story, I realized it's not exactly a story of progress necessarily. I mean, there have not been very many successes, with a few exceptions that we can kind of talk about. But I realized I needed to tell not just the story of how childcare workers have organized, but kind of the variety of reasons why it's so challenging for childcare workers to organize for better wages and working conditions, and to try to understand the various logics that shaped the creation of the childcare workforce over the past half century.
I could make a guess. It's quintessentially women's work.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's often directly tied to women's salaries too, right? It's oftentimes families make decisions about whether for mothers to remain in the workforce based upon whether or not their wages are higher than what they would be paying for a childcare worker, right? So those things are often because we have this entirely marketized approach to childcare in the United States. These decisions are entirely often, based around or connected to women's employment.
Well, how did you get interested in this subject?
My first full-time job after college was as a nanny. I was a nanny for first one family and then another in Hanover, New Hampshire. Well, I loved the family. They lived in New Hampshire. They went to college, was at Dartmouth. They graduated they'd gone to live in New York City after college, and the husband had worked in investment banking, and so the husband stayed in New York City, and so to keep his job, and so he would work there 5 days a week, and what that meant was that, but in order for them to continue having the kind of highly paid jobs that they had in New York and the same kind of lifestyle, they decided for the husband to keep his job in New York, he would work there 5 days a week and commute home on the weekends. And what that meant was that the wife, who was raising two children, was raising them largely on her own for 5 days a week. So they decided to hire a nanny. And so I was working alongside the mother. We were kind of co-parenting. We became very, very close. And I really loved the work. I got to know her kids really well. I got to know her really well. It was this close dynamic. And, we had a good relationship. And then one day she asked me, they wanted to switch it up for a weekend, and they wanted for us to all go to New York City for the weekend and to stay at the husband's apartment. But they said there wasn't enough room for me to stay there. And so the mother asked, and we were sitting there and feeding the children lunch together, and she asked if I would be willing to accept a hotel room in exchange for wages that weekend. So she wanted me to go and care for their kids, but she didn't want to pay me. She wanted to pay me in a hotel room. And I said immediately, I said, no, I don't really want to do that. And she asked me why. And I said, well, ultimately, this is a business relationship, which just seemed like the obvious reason to me. I didn't want to work for free. And, now I travel for work, right? I go to a conference or something like that. And I'm not getting paid in my hotel room. I'm still getting my salary. So it just seemed to me like if you need someone to travel for a job, you have to pay them for the hotel room, or you have to pay them in addition to the hotel room. So anyway, I said it was a business relationship, and that was like totally the wrong answer. And her face fell, and she said, I don't want you around my children if you feel that way.
Goodness.
Sent me home for the rest of the day. And she called me back later on that, I was like totally devastated. It was my first real job.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say real job, but my first full-time job. And I love the children and I love the work. And I was just completely devastated and embarrassed and hurt. And she called me back later that night and asked me to come back, but she said that our relationship would have to change. We couldn't have all these meals together. We couldn't be close. We needed to really treat it like a business relationship. She was kind of punishing me for this. And after that, I ended up taking a job with another family about a month later because it had just grown too strained. And I worked in childcare for another half year. But that conversation just stuck with me for so many years afterward. It was like, why was that so devastating to her to have me refer to this relationship as a business relationship? And a lot of people, I think, have to somehow think about the person who's caring for those you love most in the world, your children. You have to kind of think that that person is doing it partly out of love, right? And I think that she knew that, and I think that's often true, but I think that just having it referred to in those very stark terms was hard for her. So, and I think that that's just a part of what makes the relationship, one of the many dynamics that makes it very challenging for childcare workers to assert their demands in addition to it in the context of the private space of the home, the structure of the industry, and all of these things. So that's one reason. And just the kind of, I was very involved in the graduate workers union, the efforts to build a graduate workers union when I was in graduate school, and was really involved in trying to support graduate workers and securing a family policy and funding from the university. And I just realized kind of how terrible it is on the family end too. I don't have kids. I don't want kids. But realizing how hard it is for families too, and that so much.
Wow. How is the United States different from other OECD nations in terms of early childhood and education? 38 developed democratic countries with market economies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how is the US different from the other ones?
Yeah, the United States is very much an outlier. I think the average, OECD spending is something like $14,000 per year per child between 0 and 5. In the United States, that number is $500. So we spend 1/28th of the average amount that an OECD nation spends on early childhood education. The United States has just chosen this approach that is focused on the private market, and the responsibility falls on families. There are structures that support childcare for low-income families. We have a means-tested approach to providing any sort of support for families with with early childhood education and care. I mean, obviously there are some exceptions to that in terms of in different states and municipalities where we're seeing the beginnings of universal child care programs. But as you know, the federal government has very limited support for early childhood education and childcare compared with most other European countries and other parts of the world.
What does the U.S. childcare industry look like? What is the structure of the workforce?
You have these kind of three types of workforces, right? There's the daycare center workers, there's private household workers, nannies and au pairs, and then there's family childcare providers. Daycare workers work in a variety of types of centers. The majority of daycare centers in the US are nonprofits. So some are run by churches and religious organizations. Some are run by, other types of kind of nonprofit programs at the local level. Some are run by some municipal child care programs. And then there are also a variety of small businesses, right? A daycare center that's run by, there's an individual and they start the center. They're often referred to as mom and pops because historically it was a husband and wife team that would run this small center. There are also corporate child care chains, Bright Horizons, KinderCare, these larger corporations that are really trying to eke out a profit in the child care industry. They represent a relatively small slice, surprisingly, of the childcare industry. The vast majority of childcare centers are small operations. And then in terms of, so that's daycare, right? Center-based care. Family childcare encompasses a great deal of variety. There are licensed family childcare providers and unlicensed family childcare providers, right? So someone who just decides if they might be caring for their own children at home and someone down the street says, hey, I need childcare. Can you help me out? Can I pay you a little bit out of pocket? And they say, sure. And it's this very informal relationship, right? Where you drop your kids off for a few hours or whatever it may be, or for the whole day when you work, you send your kids to the neighbors and it's informal. There are many licensed family child care providers too who have a more kind of formal relationship. Some of them, actually a great deal, will have a relationship with the state where the funding, so they're able to kind of get subsidy-based or reimbursement funding for children whose families qualify for that because of income. So there's family childcare with this kind of great amount of, there's a great deal of diversity, and then there's daycare, and then there are a relatively small number of au pairs, about 20,000 au pairs coming to the US annually from different parts of the world. And then nannies, we don't know exactly what percentage of nannies are in the United States. But in the, nannies, there's a ton of diversity among nannies, from very elite, fairly highly paid nannies working for wealthy families, to nannies who are completely kind of under the table, and some of whom are here as undocumented workers and, are living under various degrees of exploitation. So it's an extremely diverse workforce and an industry. And I think, childcare workers themselves oftentimes don't think about the workforce as, themselves as being in the same workforce, a daycare worker and a nanny as being necessarily in a kind of the same workforce. You have, daycare workers might identify more as daycare workers and family childcare providers as family childcare providers.
Have child care workers organized for better wages and working conditions? And if so, how have they done it?
It's starting in the first efforts among childcare workers to organize was in the 1960s. So New York City it's changed a lot over the years, but a relatively unique childcare system. So, and I should probably kind of back up and give a little bit of historical context here that during World War II, the federal government, through the Lanham Act, created federally run, well, not run by the federal government, but federally funded childcare centers, 3,000 of them throughout the country. I believe they served up to, 1.5 million children, primarily for women who were working in war industries. And then after the end of the Second World War, Congress withdrew that funding. And coalitions of parents and other activists in many different parts of the country fought to keep those centers open with state and municipal dollars. They succeeded in only a few different areas, one of which was New York City. New York City had the most robust publicly funded childcare system in the country. In the 60s was running 300 daycare centers, more than 300 daycare centers, with more than 6,000 workers. These workers ended up organizing with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Workers, or AFSCME, municipal employees. And AFSCME, was very much involved with, it was a kind of the 60s were this moment in which there was an enormous expansion of public sector unionism. And AFSCME organized these daycare workers in New York City. They ended up going on strike for 3 weeks in 1969. And winning wages that were among the highest of any daycare workers in the country, that were coming close to beginning to approach some parity with public school teachers, although they never really got there. They won a health and welfare fund, some health insurance support, and that's probably the largest effort that there have been among childcare workers to organize. And then there were a number of smaller grassroots efforts in the 1970s in Boston, in Madison, in Berkeley, among these, largely feminists who had gotten involved with childcare because they, as a kind of extension of their feminism, and started organizing. They realized how bad the wages were, and they saw it as a feminist issue. And they started organizing their centers. And, pretty quickly, many of these daycare activists realized that it's really, really difficult to improve wages and working conditions through a union in the context of a privately funded center, right? That doesn't have any kind of public funding, because most of these centers operate on either, they're either nonprofits or they're operating on very limited profit margins. The budget's small. And so there wasn't a lot of room within the budgets to increase wages and to provide health insurance. And so centers had to increase fees, parent fees, in order to be able to address, to meet the union contracts. And in order to increasing parent fees often meant, in this context of this atomized industry in which you have lots of different small centers and they're not consolidated, that parents will just go to a different center, right? If the fees go up that much, then you're going to move around in the context of the market. And so it's really difficult to do that. And daycare workers realized, what they needed to do was fight for a public system, a public, universal childcare system that would be funded by the government, so that it wouldn't be a zero-sum game between daycare workers and parents, but rather a kind of like, with public school teachers, they're not fighting a kind of a zero-sum game with parents, or in order to improve their wages, they're bargaining with state governments, right, or local school districts. So, the fight was largely about increasing public awareness and trying to get parents to be allies in the fight for a universal childcare system.
I think you mentioned some different things happening in different states, but what is the picture around the United States these days?
There have been, New York City continues to have somewhat of a public, there are many of those centers. There are still some that are open, although New York City shifted largely to family childcare as being its public mechanism in the wake of welfare reform. But, in recent years, there have been a number of different efforts, including in New York City and New Mexico and Vermont, to create movements toward universal childcare systems, either through a kind of universal pre-K or childcare for 3-year-olds. And many of these efforts, like for instance, in New Mexico, the state is committed to providing childcare for all children, right? It's not free childcare. It's not an entitlement. It's trying to make childcare much more affordable to all families. The problem in many of these cases is that there's not without an effort to really increase the workforce, the problem is supply. There's not enough supply to meet demand. And so there have been some efforts to increase supply, but you can't increase supply without increasing wages. I mean, there's not that many people who are going to want to go into this really low wage work. Lots of people love working with children, but if you can't pay the bills, you can't really go into this work. And I think that that's probably New York City and Mamdani's efforts are actually really thinking about how can wages be increased, not by small margins, but really thinking about childcare needs to become a profession. We need to start thinking about childcare workers, early years teachers, as in the same way we think about a public school teacher as being a professional, and that in the same way all workers are entitled to fair wages, we need to be thinking about how do we make this the type of work that people actually want to go into because it's well compensated. Childcare workers are, and as a socialist, I don't necessarily think that education should be tied to whether or not you make a good living or not, but it is worth noting because many childcare workers have noted this historically, that they're they are highly educated in many cases. Most childcare workers have either bachelor's degrees or a fair amount of post-secondary education, and their wages are often comparable to those of fast food workers. Right. So it's not work that people, regardless of whether or not you want to go into it, it's really hard to justify given the wages. So any efforts to try to really expand the childcare system are going to have to think about the wages of childcare workers, and not incrementally, but in terms of really transforming the field so that childcare workers are truly fairly paid, as all workers should be.
Yeah, and miraculously in New York State, apparently Kathy Hochul, the governor, is somewhat in favor of this, unlike many other human needs that she seems to think are just useless.
Right. Hochul has made steps, I think still thinks about this in terms of the structure as opposed to Mamdani's approach that's thinking about really expanding a system and thinking about daycare as being comparable to K through 12 education. Hochul is very much still thinks about it in terms of the market and how can we continue to use market mechanisms, but does, yes, I think that she has made a number of statements recently and seems to be moving toward the possibility of a more universal approach.
Perhaps you could just focus a little on why is the issue important to socialists?
So I think there's a number of reasons why this issue should matter so much to us as socialists. Capital sees the private family as a solution to its problems, right? There's this sociologist whose work I really like, Melinda Cooper, has this book, Family Values. And, she really sees this as, the reason that neoliberals and neoconservatives have made such kind of strange but happy bedfellows is because they've been able to agree on the private family as being a kind of mechanism for social welfare provision. Neoliberals don't care about the family as such, but they're willing to instrumentalize the family, right? If you shift all the social welfare functions of the state onto the market, families end up absorbing a great deal of that. Conservatives, on the other hand, right, will see this as being they want the family to be stronger, the private family to be stronger. And so if the state gets rid of its social welfare functions and foist more of them onto the market, they believe that families are going to become stronger as a result of that, right? And so families are kind of this catch-all solution that in which like as the state kind of fails to care for its citizens, families absorb that alongside the market. As socialists, we understand that I think for people to be truly free to do meaningful work and have meaningful relationships, our basic needs can't be tethered to our employment, right? And they also can't be tied to our biological families. And we need a state that meets social welfare needs, whether that's housing, healthcare, education, and childcare in order to survive. So I think that we really, we don't want our fellow workers, our fellow citizens to feel as though they are tethered to these institutions in order to be able to make a decent living and to get by and to raise their children. And so we need to have a broad, expansive provision.
And quickly, who is in charge of childcare locally here in this area? City, county, school districts, not-for-profit, commercial.
Childcare in the Finger Lakes and Tompkins County is really similar to other parts of the country in terms of, primarily being it's, the market, private families that are responsible for it. There is some public funding that's available, but we don't have a kind of a public system in here. So it's, there are nonprofits, there are small daycare centers, there's family childcare providers. Cornell operates a center that's run by Bright Horizons. So there's one, at least corporate childcare chain that's in our area, but the Finger Lakes is comparable to other areas.
Well, I think the city does a little through GIAC.
Okay. Yeah, there's some, sometimes there'll be like some pots of funding that city or county governments will provide.
Okay. And there's the Child Care Council, which is, I think, a not-for-profit. Thank you, Justine Modica.
Thanks,
We've
Theresa.
heard a lot about child care and what a messed up field it is. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.